we're really looking forward to this very, very critical, timely, and important presentation. So thank you, everyone. I am muting and shutting off my video as well.
Thank you. Okay, I am not going to delay. I know we all want to get to this amazing program that we have for today. I do first want to say I have to thank Lori Berman for putting us in touch with Teen Lifeline and helping to set this up. If you are not familiar with Teen Lifeline, you should check out their website, teenlifeline.org. They have a hotline and various prevention programs, including speaker programs like the one you're about to see today. Our presenter today is Mackenzie Gates, and she is going to give us some information that's very important and very timely so we can all have information and resources we need to communicate with our teens and our children at home and in our schools, find out what it is that we need to be looking for and how to approach something if it looks like something that we need to give our attention to. So I will turn this over now. But I just want to say I did get a couple questions sent to me. If you have another question that you would like to ask Mackenzie, feel free to put that in the chat and we will try to get those answered today. If we're not able to get them answered today, we will stay in touch with Mackenzie and Teen Lifeline or other individuals who we think can help get you the information you need. And I turn it over to Mackenzie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Can everyone see me okay? Hopefully.
Yes, we can hear you and see you. Thank you so much, Mackenzie. It's
excellent. Great. Awesome. I was having some technical difficulties earlier, so just wanted to make sure everything was okay. Well, I am so excited to be here. Usually when I speak to parents, it's in the evenings after everyone's at work all day and with their kids all day. So it's nice to kind of do something different in the morning. So I will go ahead and get started. Let me go ahead and share my screen and start my presentation. Okay. Excellent. And I will go ahead and try to keep the chat up as well so I see everything you guys send. The majority of my job is working directly with teenagers, and they often don't, wait to ask a question or raise their hand or just shout something out. So please, if you have anything that you are wondering or wanting me to go over a little bit more or have questions about, please feel free to throw it in the chat, unmute yourself. I am here to answer anything that you're curious about. So today we are going to talk about, and what I talk about for most of my job is suicide prevention, specifically with adolescents, whether that be with teenagers, our middle school tweens. We're going to talk a little bit about, best practices, about my agency, Teen Lifeline, and some more interesting things. So let's go ahead and get started. So I wanted to start off today by talking a little bit more about Teen Lifeline. I know that some of you are a little bit more familiar with us and some of you might not have heard about us before. So our agency started in the Valley in 1986, so about 34 years ago, when Arizona was second in the nation for rates of teen suicide. So obviously we were doing very poorly. We did have resources at the time when it came to suicide prevention, but not a lot specifically geared towards teenagers. At this time as well, in 1986, was when a made-for-TV movie called Surviving came out. It got a lot of press because it was starring It Girl at the time, Molly Ringwald, and it was about just kind of focusing on the issue of teen suicide and the prevalence of it, and it brought a lot of attention and funding to the issue, and that is a big reason why we are here today. Of course, and luckily, we look a lot different than we did 34 years ago. Our services actually started in the basement of Central High School, where our clinicians, so people like social workers, psychologists, trained their teenagers how to talk to other teenagers about any problem that could be going on in their life. So our services really started, and still at the heart of everything we do is our peer-to-peer crisis hotline. So we train teenagers ages 15 to 19 how to pick up the phone or answer texts from young people all across the state, and sometimes from different states or different countries, which is kind of cool, about any problem they could possibly be going through. About a third of the calls and texts we get are about suicide. So obviously that is a huge part of what we do as a crisis hotline. But because we work with youth and teenagers, we get calls and texts about things like having a bad day, getting a bad grade on a test, getting into a fight with their friend, family member, significant other, all the way to some of those more serious topics, right? Things like suicidal ideation, abuse that could be going on, sexual assault. So really our teenagers go through so much training, and they're incredible, to be able to talk to teenagers all across the state about anything that could be going on in their lives. We found that, I'm sure as you guys know as adults, and I am also an adult, that sometimes for teenagers, it's just way easier to talk to their peers than it is to talk to adults, because it can be kind of scary. They don't know what we're going to say and how we're going to react. And a lot of times kids just understand each other and know what they're going through. I am definitely a younger adult. I started out in the program when I was 16. But even though I, graduated, 5-6 years ago, I can definitely not say that I understand what it's like to be a teenager right now, especially in this pandemic and with what's going on. So that is really where our hotline and our mission was born, is really to empower communities and empower our youth, and provide a service where people can, reach out to us and get help, specifically teenagers, but really to anybody. So our crisis hotline is open 24/7, 365 days a year. Since we are a peer counseling crisis hotline though, we have teenagers in our office every day from 3 to 9. Just because like your kids, they have to, go to school, go to sleep, hang out with their friends and family. So luckily we have an awesome partnership with Crisis Response Networks, a CRN. And after 9 p.m. and before 3 p.m., those are the people who will answer all those calls that gets transferred over to them from our hotline. We also have texting service, which is really exciting because that's new, even since I was a peer counselor when I was a teenager here. So again, between the hours of 3 and 9, when our kids are in our office, kids from all across the state can, call, text us about anything that could be going on. Our hotline is free, costs absolutely no money to call or text our phone number. It is anonymous and it is confidential. Of course, there are cases when like safety comes into play and we have to get other people involved. But for the most part, we are able to uphold that confidentiality almost, I'd say for 98% of our calls, which is something that we think is really important. Another thing about our hotline real quick before I kind of move on to some of our other services that I think it's really interesting and definitely something that we're proud of is our Aas Accreditation. We have had our Aas Accreditation for, I want to say maybe a little less than 2 decades. I think it was 2003, I like to say. And this is something that was really important to us and makes us stand out because we are the first peer counseling crisis hotline in the nation to receive this honor. Basically what it means when your agency, specifically crisis hotlines, are accredited by AAS is that the people we train to pick up the phones are just as qualified as clinicians or any other peer initiatives across the nation. So our kids have so much training and are upheld to such great standards that we meet all the criteria to be accredited through the American Association of Suicidology. So definitely something that we're proud of and that we've held on for about 17, 18 years. Apart from our crisis hotline, we also do prevention workshops, which is what we're doing here today. This is almost my entire job. I get to talk to people about, suicide, and luckily most of the time I get to talk to people about suicide prevention, which is really what to look for and how to help people and really how to support our community and our kids. When it comes to prevention workshops, I do a lot of work with parents, just like you guys. I do most of my workshops, I'd say would be about teen depression and suicide. But we also do a lot of different workshops on conflict resolution, stress and coping, in addition to post-prevention services as well. This is a part of our job where we can go into communities after there's been a death by suicide and provide support and education around that as well. Another big part of my job is giving education to students. So we go into schools, not as much this year with the pandemic happening, and provide the same type of education. So whether that be teen suicide and depression, stress and coping, conflict resolution, grief and loss, any of those type of topics, we get to those students as well. And then a lot of our focus this year has been on staff presentations, especially complying with the Mitch Warnock Act mandate, which I will talk about a little bit more later on in the presentation when we talk about mandate reporting, things like that. But we've been providing a lot of education to staff members this year, which is really awesome. And now required by law, which is great. The other part of what we do is our life skills development training. This is the training that all of our peer counselors go through to clear the hotline. They go through training on pretty much any topic that could come up that would be an issue in our kids' lives, and learn all the basic counseling skills, intervention techniques that I learned in my graduate program, which is really awesome. Along the right-hand side here, we know we also do our ID initiative, which is something that started in the Paradise Valley Unified School District, which is very exciting and something we're very proud of. We started this initiative in 2015 in 13 schools, and now, as of the last time I checked the numbers, for 2020, we are in 263 schools, which is very exciting as well. We also do lots of outreach initiatives. We go into schools and table, talk about our services with a bunch of other agencies, and just try to get our name out there and provide resources to our kids. So I'll just go ahead and take a second. Does anybody have any questions about Teen Lifeline, our services, any of the things I just kind of went over? Feel free to unmute yourself, throw it in the chat. Happy to answer any questions. I know I kind of went quickly. Excellent. So I'm not seeing anything, but if anything does come up or you think of something, let me know. I'm happy to answer it.
Well, actually,
yeah.
I think what's going on is no one can unmute themselves right now, so we weren't prepared for that. Julie, can you jump on with the questions you have, and I'll go through and unmute people?
Oh, excellent. Sorry about that, guys. Oh, I see. Okay, I got one.
Sure. Yeah, and people feel free to like write in the chat, or they can let us know in the chat if they want to be unmuted. Are you, did you want questions on just overall services, or do you want their open questions? Or, you know, because I have some, but I didn't know if you were going to give more of the program first, or if you're
Definitely.
ready.
So yeah, if we could start out, I'll go ahead and answer any questions about Teen Lifeline and any of our initiatives and programs. Later on, I'll talk more about like intervention techniques and all that kind of stuff. But I'm happy to go ahead and answer any questions.
Okay, there's a question in the chat. Can you explain what ID initiative means?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't cover that as much as I wanted to. So the IAD initiative is something that was initiated in 2015, and it was actually one of the principals at in your lovely district that started it, when unfortunately one of their students died by suicide. Unbeknownst to us as an agency, Troy went ahead and printed our information on the backs of all of his student IDs, just so that they could have an extra connection to resources as students to reach out to. So I believe it was our number, and then the local like CRN or crisis number as well. We found out about this through one of our kids that was actually volunteering with us when they showed us the back of their ID and was like, oh, this is how I found out about you guys. And we thought it was such an excellent idea that now Troy is on our board. But it is a really, really cool initiative that we started, basically that we partner with a lot of different printing companies and different schools to print our information on the back of student ID cards, so that students, when they are in crisis or need a connection to hope, that's just another place that they can find resources and our phone number that's easily accessible for them. I know that this year with COVID, we've also come out with like little stickers that kids can like put on laptops and iPads and like things like that. Same concept. It just talks a little bit about, you know, if you need a connection to hope, if you need help, this is a number to reach out to, and just a little bit more information about that.
There's a couple questions that were sent to me, but they're more of a specific circumstances. So I think maybe you'd want to go through and speak a little bit more, and then when you're ready, I can put those in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
For sure. I can go ahead and do that.
And also, just before you start up again, I just want to remind everyone, if you do have a question, you can type it in the chat, or you can ask in the chat to be unmuted. And one of our hosts will make sure that you're unmuted at the time that we are open to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, please feel free to throw it in the chat. I have it up right now on my screen, so I'll answer anything that I see that comes my way. So now kind of getting into more of the topic information about teen suicide and, you know, what we can do as caring adults and parents to help our kids build resiliency and support them. So the first thing that I like to talk about when we do talk about suicide is the way that we talk about it. Just because language is really important and it changes the connotation of what things can mean. Language is something that also, as we all know, changes all the time. So if you were using any of these terms, it's not necessarily bad or wrong. There's just more like best practices that goes into how we talk about suicide. So before, I know that it was very common practice to say, you know, when someone died by suicide, that they committed suicide. But this is something that we try to stay away from when we talk about suicidality. And that is because usually when we say that someone committed something, we're usually referring to a crime or a sin or something inherently negative or bad. And that is just an extra negative connotation that we don't want to add to this already, negative topic, and just kind of that bias that goes along with it. When it comes to attempts, whether that is an attempt that leads to someone's death or an attempt that they survive, we want to try to stay away from the terms unsuccessful or successful attempt. We know that when we were talking about a successful attempt, this is something that actually leads to someone, losing their life and dying. So instead, we just talk about it as a suicide death or an attempt. When it comes to an unsuccessful attempt, again, it just puts that a bias and kind of negative connotation on top of something that's already so taboo. And so instead of just saying unsuccessful attempt, we just say suicide attempt. So now we're going to go ahead and get into some of the topic information. So really, how and what can we look for to identify youth that might be at risk? So what are the things we can notice? What are the things we should look out for? And then next, we're going to talk a little bit more about what can we do with those signs that we do notice. So the first thing we're going to talk about are risk factors and warning signs. So risk factors and warning signs are both things that we can notice about somebody that would just make us really concerned that they might be thinking about suicide. So risk factors, like it says on the left, are things that we are usually either born into the world with or things that just happen to us that are usually out of our control, and that can just make us a little bit more vulnerable to thinking about suicide. Every single person in the world, I have them, you have them, every single person in the world has risk factors. That does not necessarily mean we will think about suicide. It just means that usually when someone has one or more of them, which we'll talk a little bit more about what those are, it just puts them a little bit more at risk for thinking about it. The other thing we're going to talk about are warning signs. So risk factors are the things that happen to us or we're born into the world with. Warning signs are really the ways that we show the people around us that we are struggling or that we might be thinking about suicide. So they're the changes that you might notice in someone that just makes you really worried. So when we talk about risk factors, usually we break it down into a couple different categories. So there can be psychological risk factors, biological factors, past history when it comes to trauma, violence, loss, and also current life events. So these are some of the most common risk factors that we find through reports of people who have died by suicide. So we know that when it comes to mental health, that undiagnosed, untreated, or ineffective treatment of a mental health challenge, or even a physical challenge, is one of those risk factors that can make us more vulnerable to thinking about suicide. When it comes to biological factors, right, the things that we are born into the world with, things like temperament and our stress threshold can also make us a little bit more vulnerable as well. So like I said, temperament, that's one of those things that we are born into the world with, kind of being like an optimist versus a pessimist. And when it comes to stress threshold, just like ourselves, and maybe for those of us that do have children, I know that when I was born, I was definitely one of those more fussy babies. My stress threshold was a little bit lower, and that's one of those things that we just kind of usually don't grow out of and we grow more into, and that can just put us a little bit more at risk. We know that past history of trauma or a loss of suicide or suicide attempt for ourselves can put us more at risk. Any sort of trauma when it comes to like domestic violence, abuse, assault, either witnessing those things or experiencing them ourselves, those can put us more at risk just because those are really tough things to deal with when those come up in our lives. Like I said before, yeah, past suicide attempt or knowing someone who has died by suicide. Current life events is something that we see a lot on the hotline, whether that be, fights with family and friends, breakups, school-related issue. And we know that history of family discorded and school-related issues are actually like the top risk factors when it came to the newest child fatality report that was just published, which makes sense because most of our kids spend most of their time with us, right, with their families or with school. And so when it comes to issues in those parts of their lives, those have really big impacts on them. We know that as loss also affects us, it affects our kids a lot, not only when somebody passes away or dies, but also losses of relationships, whether that is a breakup, losing a friend, divorce, even sometimes when our kids have to, move, change in their community, whether that be their school community, neighbors, friends, support systems, and things like that. We know that that could be a struggle as well. We know that alcohol and drug use is one of those risk factors. We know that when kids either use drugs or alcohol, it lowers their inhibitions, makes them more impulsive, or when that's something that's around in the house a lot that they're exposed to, that can also increase their risk. We know that bullying can definitely come into play, not only for the person being bullied, but for the bully themselves. Usually just because it's not a very typical kind of behavior. Usually something else is going on underneath. We know the illness of self or family member, just as, undiagnosed, untreated, or ineffective treatment of mental health challenge, when our physical health or someone we know's physical health is struggling, that can be hard as well. And then the last one on here is expectations. So this is something that, especially in the last couple of years, we've noticed a lot on the hotline, and when I'm in schools in person as well. Not only that our kids feel a lot of pressure from expectations that are put onto them, but that they just have really, really high expectations of themselves. And that they just kind of feel that pressure of not being able to live up to those expectations or not being good enough, especially with social media and getting to see, kids that are, they might not have had access to before, doing, amazing things or being famous, or, just that increase of access. It makes it a lot harder for them, especially when those expectations are unrealistic. The next thing we're going to talk about, as far as identifying youth that could be at risk, are warning signs. So like I said, risk factors are just the things that come up in our life and happen to us or are born to the world with, while warning signs are the ways that we show people around us that we are not okay, or that we are thinking about suicide or something is wrong. Warning signs are just kind of like those red flags that invite help or show the people around us that we are not okay. We know that any kind of change for that person can be a warning sign, whether it is a positive change or a negative change, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But that it's really important to kind of know the person, to know what those signs might be, just because they're very individual. When I am struggling and having a hard time, people who are most likely to know are my family, my friends, my coworkers, just because they kind of know my baseline and know what's normal for me and can tell when something's wrong. So the more we know the person, the easier it usually is for us to tell what their warning signs might be, just because we know what their normal is. When it comes to the type of warning signs that we can notice about somebody, this can either be their actions, change in their actions, change in behavior, physical changes that you might notice, changes in the things that they might say that just make you really worried, or just those changes in feelings or emotions. So the first one we're going to talk about are actions, so behavioral changes that you might notice that would just make you really worried that someone would be thinking about suicide. So I'm just going to go through them kind of quickly, and we can touch on any more that you guys have questions on. But we know, like, just for kind of signs and symptoms of depression, we'll notice that if someone is thinking about suicide, usually they will withdraw, whether that is from friends, family, school, work, just the things that are important in their lives. They all of a sudden will kind of isolate themselves, not want to be around us, not want to do the things that they usually enjoy doing, so that loss of interest. We also might notice an increase in impulsive or reckless behavior, right? Just not really caring what happens to them, or just kind of like what impact it might have on their life. We know that increased alcohol or drug use is one of those warning signs. Not necessarily like a kid going to a party, having a beer, right? It's not really what that one means. It's really when we notice someone using drugs and alcohol to cope with their problems, or to feel better, especially if you notice an increase in that behavior or kind of new starts in that behavior. We know that internet search history can be one of those warning signs. The internet is a really amazing, cool, awesome place, but they definitely have some scary websites and forums where if kids really want to, they can kind of look for ideas and ways to end their life. But definitely, anytime you see something that kind of sticks on an internet search history having to do with suicide, or any of those other kind of just concerning keywords, definitely something to look out for as well. We know that like increased impulsive and reckless behavior, increased aggression, getting into fights, that might be something we see. I know when I go into schools, for most kids, when I ask them this question, if it's easier to show that they're mad or that they're sad, for most of our kids, it's way easier to show that they're upset or angry and mad than it is to be vulnerable and show that they're sad. So a lot of ways it might come out as increased aggression as well. And lastly on here are final arrangements. So these are things that we might notice somebody do if they have been thinking about suicide and maybe are starting to kind of make a plan for their death. So these are things like giving away the things that are really important to them, which for our kids might be totally different, right? They can be things that are usually really meaningful to them, or have a lot of significance, are really important to them, things that are really expensive. Just kind of depends on the person and what those items are for them. And then the last one on here is saying goodbye. So goodbyes are a little bit tricky because often it's not the person saying actually the words goodbye. Usually the statements are a little bit more vague. And like I said, with warning signs, it's really unique to that person and it has to just be something different from their normal behavior. When we usually hear people saying their goodbyes, it's usually expressed as thanking someone for all the things that they've done for them, like showing a lot of gratitude, thanking them for being a great person in their life, or expressing some sort of, guilt or sorrow for what they put you through. So if you have kids or kids that that is just the way that they normally communicate, like they just gush on you, tell you how awesome that you are all the time and just love on you, which I hope that you all have children in your life that do that. That is not necessarily one of those signs for them that something is wrong or that they might be thinking about suicide. This is really one of those warning signs for kids that usually just wouldn't talk like that. Like it would be really, really weird for them to just come out to you out of the blue and just say, hey, thank you so much for being so supportive to me or for everything you've done. It's more for those kids that would just be really odd behavior. The next type of warning signs we're going to talk about are physical changes that you might notice in somebody if they were to think about suicide. As you can see, that underneath each one of the headings here, there's a plus or a minus. And that usually means that for any one of these physical changes, it can be positive or negative. This can come into play when it comes to change in weight or appetite, change in sleep. So when I talk to kids in classrooms and when we talk a lot about stress and what's going on in their life, just as I'm sure it goes the same for you guys, I know when I am really stressed out, I am a person that I just totally lose my appetite and I cannot sleep at all. My mind is just rushing and going through all the stressors of the day. So just like for me, those are kind of those more negative changes. For some of our kids, they will, kind of eat all those comfort foods, want to eat everything in sight, want to sleep all day. We might even notice, some physical health complaints. And then the last one that I want to talk about are changes in appearance as well. So this is one that's kind of interesting that comes up a lot. That is one of those plus or minus ones that people don't usually think about. So when I go into schools and talk to parents, I think a lot of the things that come to our mind first when we think of someone that's struggling, especially with thoughts of suicide, is that they will kind of look maybe a little bit more disheveled. They'll look like unwell and like they're not doing so great. Maybe they won't take care of their hygiene, right? Which can definitely be the case. But something that is a little bit tricky about warning signs, it can also be the exact opposite. So we did postvention in a school a couple years ago. And postvention is when we come in after, there's been a death of a student or a staff member by suicide. And when we talked to the staff and the students on campus, they all said how surprised they were by the student's death. This is someone who had been struggling for a really long time. She had several, mental health concerns, had been in and out of the hospital. So this was something she'd been struggling with for a while. But why it came as a shock to people is because in the week or two before her death, she kind of started to look a lot better, act a lot better, be more talkative, participate more. And she kind of was doing her hair and was dressing more nicely than usual. And it's one of those things that's a little bit confusing when it comes to suicide, because a lot of times we think that the signs are going to be one way when they're actually another. So we know that when people are thinking about suicide and actually start to plan for their death, especially when it's someone that's been struggling for a long time, that this can actually be kind of a relief to them, right? They might feel better because they know what they're going to do and how they're going to handle all their problems and their issues and kind of the pain that's going on with them. So just things to look out for. Any major change, remember, that's just not usual. They can be positive or negative. The next thing we're going to talk about are the phrases or the things that you might hear someone say that would just make you really worried that they're thinking about suicide. So we know that when people in general talk about things like killing themselves, feeling like a burden, or that the world will be better off without them, feeling like they're in a lot of pain or trapped, that they want to give up, and then especially those words helpless or hopeless, are really, really kind of those words that should be sticking out in our head and give us those red flags and that weird gut feeling when we hear them. These are things that signal immediate risk, just like any of the other warning signs, and just any change in what that person's normal is. So when it comes to statements that you might hear about suicide, that should make you worried. These are kind of broken down into two different segments. So we usually hear people talk about suicide, whether it's on the hotline or whether I'm in schools, by saying things that are a little bit more direct. Like I'll have kids call the hotline or just tell me in person, I want to kill myself. I want to die. I'm thinking about suicide. Right? Things that when people say them to me, I do not have to make like a wild guess at what they're thinking, right? It's very straightforward. They're telling me exactly what they're thinking and how they're feeling. But just as much as I hear statements like that, I also hear very indirect statements. So these are statements that, although they allude that something is wrong, usually we have to ask some more questions to figure out what's going on and if they're thinking about suicide. So these are statements like, I don't want to be here anymore. I wish I could disappear. There's nothing left. Things like, everyone would be better off without me. I can't do this. So just those statements that give you that weird feeling in your stomach that something's not right. They don't explicitly mention suicide, something wanting to kill themselves, but they should just make us worried, right? We need to ask some more questions to figure out exactly what's going on. And the last type of warning sign we're going to talk about are feelings that you might notice change in our youth. A lot of these warning signs and risk factors apply to adults as well. But when it comes to youth, we know that they will kind of feel like the gambit of feelings and emotional changes when they are feeling suicidal. And these are the things that they might show to us. We know that some people feel lonely, numb, sad. Like I said, helpless and hopeless are those big words. We know that when someone feels helpless, like there's nothing that they can do to make their situation any better, or they feel hopeless, like they just have no hope that things are going to get better. Those are those things that are really tied to suicidality, just because that usually leads to the person feeling really stuck and out of control of their situation. We know that, like we said before, rage is something that's really common, someone being more angry than usual, usually like those little things that wouldn't bother us, all of a sudden, bother that person a lot more. Of course, someone, might feel depressed, feel worthless, have a lot of anxiety, loss of interest, irritability, humiliation, guilt, all those kind of things as well. And then kind of like what we were talking about earlier as well, that unexplained happiness, kind of one of those warning signs that's similar to a positive change in appearance. And that we just know that sometimes when people have been struggling for a long time and are in a lot of pain and have a lot of problems, and they finally decide on how to solve them and their method is suicide, they can all of a sudden feel a lot better, right? They kind of know what they're going to do. So just all things to look out for, and right, just any major change that you notice that makes you worried. So before I continue, does anyone have any questions about risk factors or warning signs? Anything that I can talk a little bit more about? Anything that was confusing or that I didn't touch on? Oh, thank you for putting the phone number in there. I appreciate that. Anything?
I'm just going to jump on here. Hi, this is Melissa Schwartz. One of the things that most of these parents should be aware of, but that I'm sure you probably or may not be aware of that has happened in this past year, is that each of our schools has a social and emotional either counselor or social worker that's been added to our schools this year. So every campus does have an additional person on the campus. So one of the things parents may not be aware of is if the school is made aware either by a teacher or by another student, that information goes to either a social worker or a counselor at the school, depending on what how the school is set up. And they're set up differently between elementary, middle, and high school. That's why I'm using those words interchangeably, because they do differ depending on what grade, level of school you're at. Those individuals will call the parents and alert the parents to any issues. So it's a very interesting system. But I think that the challenge is, as with this teen hotline, and with other organizations, is if you're given that call, where do you go to get help? Because the school is very limited on what they can provide. So other than your Teen Lifeline, are there other resources you can recommend to parents, especially if they've got someone that's younger than a teen, perhaps, Are there places they can go to get some help, say for depression or, some of these other issues that you're talking about, as well as say cutting, which has become a real big thing for middle and high school kids. And these all go on the same line, right? I mean, they all have similar self, damaging elements to them. So are there any other resources that you might be able to provide?
Absolutely. So I will send Lori a huge list of resources that I have, and I'll also go over towards the end of the presentation some of the more poignant ones having to do with like crisis, suicide, self-injury, all the stuff you're talking about. So great question. Yes, I have lots of resources I give you, I promise. And then one of the other things I'm going to go over in a couple slides is mandated reporting, which is what you brought up as well. And it sounds like all of your schools are doing exactly what they're supposed to. And that is whenever a child discloses or a student discloses that they are having thoughts about hurting themselves, hurting somebody else, whether that be suicidal thoughts, thoughts of self-injury, there's a whole process in place that we can talk about to make sure that your kids stay safe, but not only that, but that you know about what's going on and can kind of have those safeguards in place and how to keep them safe and supported. But great question, thank you. Anything else before we move on? Okay, well, if anyone does have anything that they think of, please feel free to throw it in the chat or unmute yourself. The next thing we're going to talk about are barriers to help. So this is something that we see a lot with our kids, and all valid excuses to why, if our kids are struggling, they're not reaching out to us, right? Whether it is as parents, school staff, people like myself, right? Like my whole job. We know that some teens believe that, the adults in their life or the people that are close to them just don't even really kind of recognize what's going on, right? They might have been struggling for so long that themselves and the people around them don't really notice anything different. We know a lot of our kids have fear of what treatment would involve, what that would look like, especially with Netflix and Hulu and all those awesome platforms right now, putting out things like American Horror Story and other shows like that. They can portray mental health treatment in a really kind of scary light. Usually we know as adults and as clinicians that oftentimes when people tell someone that they're feeling suicidal, they don't even necessarily need to go to a hospital all the time, right? As long as the adults and the people in their life think that they can keep them safe. A lot of our kids we hear on the hotline and in schools believe that nothing can help. They've been feeling this way for a while. They've tried all these different things. They just feel kind of stuck. Some of our kids don't see help seeking as a sign of strength. They feel like reaching out makes them look weak, or that people are going to judge them. Sometimes our kids are embarrassed of what people might say. They will believe that adults won't understand or get what they're going through. They could be scared of disappointment or anger. This is something that from working with parents for many years, I know that most parents, are not angry or disappointed when their kid comes up to them and tells them, that they're thinking about hurting themselves, they're thinking about suicide. But unfortunately, like in my years of working in schools and with parents, I have had some that are angry and disappointed. Usually those come from places of fear, right? And just not knowing what to do or feeling overwhelmed. But it's definitely a real fear in some of our kids' eyes. And then something we've been hearing a lot about lately, especially on our hotline and the texts we've been getting, is kids that are just really worried about their family's finances. They don't want to kind of overburden them with what they're already, working through, whether that's like a difficult job situation, not having a lot of insurance. And they feel like if they talk to their parents about what's going on, that it's gonna, put them in a financial situation just because we know therapy can be expensive for sure. But there are lots of different organizations and agencies that can provide either free therapy or sliding scale therapy. And that is what I spend quite a bit of my job talking to kids about, is different kind of options and agencies that they can get help from. But these are all definitely real fears that our kids have and why they don't really reach out as much as you hope that they would. So the next step is really, how do we intervene? So we notice these things that are making us really concerned or worried, whether that is the things that our kids are saying or those changes in their behavior, or we know just something really hard is going on in their life. What is the next step? So that is what we are going to talk about. So like was brought up earlier, when it comes to staff in schools, When they notice those warning signs or hear kids talking about suicide or get word from maybe another student or from a staff member that something funky is going on, it is their job as mandated reporters to make sure that it goes to the appropriate person. And like was said earlier, this looks a little bit different from school to school, but usually this looks like an immediate handoff to a counselor or someone in the admin team, whether that's, social emotional learning staff, social worker, any of those kind of people. Sometimes it's principals, depending on what the school kind of looks like and how they structure it. But basically what's next is that if a student or a staff member or someone on campus is really worried about a student, they must, required by law, report that and make sure that the student is seen. The counselor or admin and whoever kind of takes that over is then responsible for making sure that that student is assessed, that parents are looped in on everything, and making sure that that student is safe and getting them the resources that they need. So what this usually looks like is calling, making a call to parents and kind of collaborating and deciding what that looks like together. Sometimes if the crisis is really acute and something needs to be done right away, they might call Crisis Response Network for a mobile team. So that is a pair of crisis counselors that can come out to where you are, whether that is at home, whether that is at school, and they can do kind of just a more thorough assessment and kind of decide what needs to be done next and give some resources. It looks a little bit different for every school. Your district has a policy, but schools kind of get a little bit of room to decide what's best for them in that structure. But when it comes to how that handoff looks, once we are notified that a student is thinking of suicide or just is doing something, or we know something that just gives us that bad feeling, is that any school staff member has to hand that student off immediately, whether that is to a counselor, social emotional staff member, that they are never let alone. And that really what's next is kind of getting those supports in place for them. This all kind of comes into play with the Mitch Warnock Act, which is something that we are really excited about, and we worked with the Warnock family a lot on over the past couple of years to get passed. And that is that it is now mandated that all school staff, whether that be just normal staff, so like teachers, or classified staff, whether that's bus drivers, cafeteria workers, anybody that works with students in 6th through 12th grade is now mandated to receive suicide prevention training at least once every 3 years. So that is something we are really excited about, just because as people that are really worried about student safety and want to make sure as many people can help support them as possible, this is just an extra step and extra training to help them. As we know, teachers wear so many hats already as it is. And one of their hats is keeping kids safe as well, as with any school staff. And so this is something that we think is really awesome just because it gives them those extra tools. I see in the chat, it says, do you work with a crisis response team? So we do work with crisis response teams. The most we work with them is through a partnership where they take over our calls, but we also work with them whenever there is someone that calls us, whether that be a youth, so like a teenager, or a parent that is in a situation where they're really worried about that person's safety. So we do work with those mobile teams or the crisis response teams. I'd say at least like once a week. For us to call out a crisis response team, we have to have adult consent for our hotline at least. And so a lot of times that is when we are really worried about someone that calls us, we, ask them to put their parents on the phone with us and kind of get them involved and call that crisis response team out together. So it's definitely something we work with them a lot. They're really awesome. But something that definitely schools have access to as well. And I see, has anything changed with COVID? So as far as what? As far as I work with crisis response teams or in schools or mandated reporting. So using crisis response teams. So not that I know of, crisis response teams will still come directly out to your house or your residence, or they'll come directly to the school. They still do in-person services. So I believe as far as it goes with their services, they're running per usual. To my knowledge, they're not doing a lot of virtual stuff. You can definitely talk to them over the phone and get suggestions from them rather than having those pair counselors come directly to you, but they're still offering all those same in-person services. I hope that answered your question. Wonderful, thank you. Any questions on mandated reporting, Mitch Warnock Act, anything like that? Okay, I'm going to continue then. So, like I said, so we notice all those things that are going on in our youth's lives, whether it's risk factors, things that are going on that just make us worried about them, or those warning signs, things that we notice about them that are just making us really concerned, changes in their behavior, the way they're talking, their physical health. This is really the best way to start a conversation with someone that we are really concerned about. This is specifically for youth, but it can really apply to anybody. So the first thing we need to do as adults is really to just notice those things that are going on that are making us worried, right? So like I said, those actions, physical health, things that they're saying, and we need to act immediately. When we notice these changes, it is signaling immediate risk, and we need to know what is going on. And the best way we can do that, the best way we can really start that conversation is by being really specific about why we're worried and why we want to have that conversation. And then asking directly, are you thinking about suicide? So as an example, and what I talk to teachers about and parents and students, is that sometimes when we just ask that question out of the blue, it makes it a lot easier to kind of put our foot and get started by kind of just listing out all the things that are making us concerned. So saying, hey, I noticed that, you haven't been turning in any of your schoolwork and you don't seem that excited to go to volleyball anymore. I don't want to really hang out with your friends. And you're just kind of staying in your room all the time and I'm really upset. I'm really worried about you. Like, are you thinking about suicide? When we ask if someone's thinking about suicide, it's really important that we do it directly and calmly and really seriously. That is because if we ask something like, are you thinking about hurting yourself? That can mean so many different things to our kids. And it's kind of kids' job to be sneaky and to make us kind of work for those answers that we are looking for. I also like to say that when we ask that question, like, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? When we ask it in that kind of way, there is a specific answer that we are trying to get from them, and they're going to want to give it to us. So that's why it's really important just to ask really directly, are you thinking about suicide? Are you having thoughts about suicide, right? This is the best way we can get the most honest answer from them. And if we are able to say the word suicide, which I know can be scary for some of us, that, obviously this is my job and I do this all the time and I ask that question and train people to ask that question. I promise you, I know that there's a myth out there that saying the word suicide is going to put it into your kids' heads. I promise you that that is not true. There have been so many studies done where that is not the case. And we know that if we are actually able to say the word suicide, it can make that person much more willing to open up. Because it can be kind of a scary thing to just offer up that information and not know what that person's going to say. But if we are brave enough to say it and to ask, it can make them a little bit more comfortable answering honestly. So that is really kind of the best chance we have of getting an honest answer from someone we're really concerned about. And then, of course, if the person says yes, we want to take it really, really seriously. Even if that person says no, something we also want to take seriously, because there's obviously some things that we've noticed that are making us concerned and something else that's going on in their life. So once we bring up the things that are concerning us and we ask them, are you thinking about suicide? The next thing really any of us can do, whether that is me as a clinician and suicide prevention specialist, you guys as parents, school staff, is really just to listen to all the things that are making them feel this bad, that they just don't want to be here anymore. There are lots of things as caring adults, all of us, kind of like our human nature to want to do, right? We're going to want to fix it and make it better and tell them everything's going to be okay. Or maybe just even like give them advice and tell them what to do and how to fix it. None of these things are necessarily harmful. They're just not super helpful. So when we listen, the best things we can do as adults is really just to kind of remain calm, validate their feelings and let them know that we care about them and that what they're going through is really hard. It is obviously, having a really big impact on them, and just making sure to really reinforce that behavior and thanking them so much to have the courage to tell you. The next thing after we listen to what's going on is really just to help get them help, right? And to reassure them that help is available and we're going to get it for them. This can look like therapy. This can look like getting that crisis response team to come out, do an assessment. This can look like, inpatient or outpatient services, things like that. I have a whole resource list that I will send out to all of you guys. I'll send it to Lori and she can disseminate that, however's easiest. But it's really important that when we tell them and they open up to us about how they're feeling, that we want to follow up and get them help because it's really serious. And when we can include them in that help-seeking process, that can be really, really helpful. So kind of just keeping them in the loop with what we're doing and what we're working on, especially because I think a lot of times when kids don't hear us talking about it, they think we just forget about it. So whether that is having them with us when we are making those kind of calls or just keeping them updated in the loop about what's going on, we want to let them know that this is really important and we didn't forget about it and we're taking it pretty seriously. Any questions about kind of this process and what it looks like? Any concerns? Not seeing anything, so I'll go ahead and continue. But if anyone wants to put anything out there, I'm happy to go back and answer. So that leads us to what can parents do? So what are the next steps? What are the best ways we can support our kids and help them be resilient and kind of just deal with all the hard things that do come up in life? So we know that just like we all have risk factors, we all have those things that come up that make us more vulnerable to thinking about suicide or just really suck, that come up in our lives. We all also have tons of protective factors, and so do our kids. So protective factors are not only the opposite of risk factors, but they are things that actually help increase our resiliency and our ability to kind of cope with everything that's going on. Protective factors are the things that help us bounce back and kind of work through and deal with the things that we're going through that are really tough. So what this looks like for our kids is when they do have some sort of, mental or physical health issue going on, just making sure that they have effective treatment and that that treatment is working for them and that it's helpful. We know that access to resources is something that's really important. And we know that a lot of times when kids can access resources directly themselves, that they are more likely to use them. Not to plug our hotline, but this is a resource that they can literally just call or text us from their own personal phone and be connected to someone and talk to someone at any time, which is really cool. But we know anytime they have access to resources, whether that is therapeutic resources, crisis resources, any of those kind of things, it really helps build their resiliency and, protect them against thinking about suicide. We know that just like us, anytime our kids feel really connected, it's something that really helps when it comes to feeling supported. Whether that is feeling connected to you guys, right, as caring parents, their family, community, school system, their classmates, their teachers. The more connected we feel to other people, the more reasons we have for living and the more support we have. Another thing that's on here are problem solving and conflict resolution skills. I'll go over this a little bit more on the next slide, but these are something that are so important and something that the sooner we can develop them, the better. Especially when it comes to adolescents that are growing up, the more that they can be independent and figure out how to solve their own problems and how to resolve conflicts, it's very, very helpful. We know that anytime we experience success, whether that is in school, being really good at certain subjects, or extracurricular, whether that is sports or music or art, any of those kind of things. Anytime we feel like we're just really good at something and we feel like we have purpose, that can help a lot. We know resiliency, which I will talk a little bit about more on the next slide, is something that's really important. And also just healthy coping skills. So as adults, I hope that we all have healthy coping skills, especially in a time that, is very stressful for us. We know that it is most important to practice our coping skills when we are not only in crisis, right? Just like a muscle, we have to work on it to make sure it's strong. And so if we have things that we can do that are creative, that help us relax, that help us exercise, and also that we're just able to communicate with other people and just get things off our chest. These are all things that are really, really important. So whether that be our kids playing video games or playing soccer or talking to their best friends or things like that, those are all things that are able to kind of help us when we're having a hard time, whether that's distracting ourselves, relaxing, or just working through what we're going through. So coping skills are always really important. So like promised, this next slide is all about building resiliency. So how can we build resiliency in our youth? So we broke it down into a couple of different areas. We know that something that's really helpful is when we focus on strengths, really kind of avoiding comparisons when we can, just because we're all good at different things, right? We all have different strengths and things that we're good When it comes to confidence, acknowledging when people do things really well, trying to avoid those unrealistic expectations when possible. A lot of kids, especially we're seeing, are just striving for perfection and want to be, the best at everything and so good. And when they, get a bad grade or don't do as well as they thought they would, they just kind of crumble. We want to try to set them up for success by kind of saying, we're not going to be good at everything, and that's okay. And the best thing we can do is just practice and try our best. We know that also with confidence, that's not only important to praise like a job well done, but also to acknowledge when someone's trying really hard. We know someone putting in a lot of effort. The next thing is, teach problem solving skills. This is something that's really, really helpful and something that we teach our kids on the hotline to do and our volunteers. And I know as adults that obviously we care so much about our children. Like, it's very hard to fight the impulse, just tell them what to do or tell them what will work best. But really the most helpful thing we can do for them is kind of when they come to us with a problem, ask them what they want to have happen with the situation, talk about their options, and kind of let them pick which is best for them. They definitely might not always pick the one that is the best or might end up the way that they wanted to, but they learn a really valuable skill and are most likely next time to kind of know how to go through that process by themselves and not necessarily rely on us for that, which is really great with independence and, raising really awesome independent kids. We know that coping is important, right? The more coping skills that we have, the better. Things that we like to do, things that help us relax or distract ourselves, just so that when we do feel stressed or we do feel overwhelmed, our kids have all those things that they know how to do, how to make themselves feel better and kind of get through it. We know that teaching empathy is important. How to look at a situation from another perspective outside your own shoes can make you just go into it with a different idea how to handle things. Any opportunities we can create for kids to contribute is really important. Like I said, we know that just like us, our kids are going to have different strengths. And the more opportunities we have for them to kind of explore what those might look like, what they might be good at, what they might not be, the better. And the last one on here is connection. So the best thing we can do is just make sure that our kids have lots of really awesome supportive people in their life that they feel connected to, that they can talk to. And for each of us, that might look a little bit different. Those roles might look a little bit differently for all of us, but having as many people in their life that are supportive, especially adults that they can go to and kind of talk about whatever's going on or lean on for support in different ways, is something that can be really, really helpful for our kids. So I have some additional resources. These are very basic. I'm going to send out a huge list with different resources for every category. When it comes to resources that we talk a lot about Crisis Response Network. They are amazing. They not only are a hotline that you can utilize as well, but they provide those crisis teams that can come out and aid at school situations or at your home personally. They can provide that pair of counselors that can come and do assessments and help you guys in any situation. But that is also what we are here for as well. Our hotline is definitely geared towards teenagers, but there is always a supervisor, someone like myself, a master's level clinician, making sure everything is going okay and there to answer any questions. So if you do ever come across a situation where you just don't know really what to do or don't know how to have that conversation or don't know what those next steps are, that is something you can absolutely call our hotline about, and we can walk you through that and help you in those situations. As far as resources, we have some additional resources on here. I'll send everybody a copy of the PowerPoint as well. We have some e-learning courses if anyone's interested in learning more about, intervention techniques, about postvention, so after suicide has occurred. These are more geared usually towards educators, but they really are for anybody if you are interested. Like I said, we also do postvention services, so we can provide crisis counselors, someone like myself and my colleagues. We can be on campus when there has been a death and just kind of helping schools and families go through that just for extra support. Talked a little bit about the ID initiative already. And that is all I have for you guys today. I know we're kind of running late, so I wanted to make sure that I had plenty of time for questions and to go over everything. I see that there are already questions, so awesome. Thank you so much. I always think it's so sad when I go through a whole presentation and no one has any questions. Awesome. So what if our teens have an interest in volunteering with Teen Lifeline? Yes, great question. Thank you. We actually just had a new training group that went through a couple weeks ago. But basically the best way to get in touch with us about volunteering is to fill out the form on our website or have them call our office number or hotline number. The only requirements is that they have to be 15, at least 15. They can be all the way up to 19, and they just have to be able to get to our office. Our office is located in Phoenix. It's a confidential location, but it's right around like 16th Street and Camelback. It's in that area. Okay, let's see. How can school social worker or other personnel set up a group staff training? Excellent question. This is most of my job actually, is coordinating and scheduling trainings. So they can get in touch with myself or anybody else at Teen Lifeline, and we can schedule something with them. Right now, when it comes to staff trainings and parent trainings, we are offering those virtually. We are not offering any education with students virtually, just because we find that, especially when talking to kids about suicide and topics like that, we'd rather be in person to make sure that for safety concerns and things like that. But we are offering virtual workshops for adults, whether that be staff members or parents. So we can definitely set that up. Reach out to myself or anybody else at my agency, and it will get routed to me. Let's see. Our Teen Lifeline trainings free for schools. Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. I forgot to mention that. All of our services are free. Everything we provide is free. Whether it's staff trainings, parent trainings, trainings in schools, our post-vention services, our hotline. That is something that we think is really, really important when it comes to access and especially education around these topics, is we want to make sure that it's accessible to everyone in every school. So yeah, all trainings are free. There is one training that we give that I think is 2 days and 16 hours, and that one, it just costs for materials. But everything else that we do, especially virtually, is all free of cost, which is awesome.
Okay, Mackenzie, this is Julie again. I have a couple questions that were submitted in advance.
Awesome.
Okay, so if you can answer, these are more specific. So just let us know what you can or can't say. When my son is very depressed, showing up for school online or in person feels like too much for him. How do I make him show up? Do I fight with him to make him show up? I usually allow for a mental health day even once a month, but there's more than one day. But if it's more than one day in a month, it feels impossible to start getting him to go. I feel like threatening him or rewarding him, but sometimes that doesn't work as well as this parent would like, and feels that some of those tactics can take away from her relationship with her son. So her question is, what is your advice in this situation? What is most important to do? And what are some of your ideas?
Great questions. Let me think. So that is definitely a difficult situation. I feel like especially with virtual learning, it's really hard to just motivate some kids to be interested and follow through and show up. So I totally understand that struggle. I think what usually works best, and what we talk to parents and kids on the hotline, is really, I mean, if you can, and it sounds like you've already tried a lot of things already. So let me know if this isn't a super helpful suggestion, but having a really open conversation about what's going on and his motivations and just kind of what his thoughts and feelings are about school and why he feels like he just can't show up and isn't as involved as he wants to be or as you want him to be. And just also kind of sharing your feelings about the situation as well, and using that as kind of a conversation to collaborate and figure out what works best. Because as parents, part of our jobs is to make sure, our kids go to school and are learning and attend, which I know that can be so hard in this pandemic world. But I think probably the best thing to do is have an open conversation about your expectations and what you want to see happen and just the best ways that you can make that happen, and really working with him towards those goals and maybe trying to set some of those things together.
Thank you. I want to reiterate also that we do have those SEL individuals at each school site. So if any parent feels that they're having some issues, they can reach out and get some tips on what might help specifically for their child, and if it is reaching another level where they do need some more support from the school, they can find out what's available that way. The next question also leads a lot into what our social emotional learning specialists can do, but there's a part for you as well. It says, my son moved to Arizona from out of state this fall. He was completely isolated and had no way of meeting kids his age, with the schools not meeting in person. Once they started in person, it was better, but he still sat at lunch for himself by himself for weeks. What can the schools do to help facilitate outreach to those kids feeling alone, both in person and online? At one point, a few kids came up to him, maybe at the direction of a teacher or on their own. It made a huge difference for him that day. This parent suggests assigning buddies or small groups that the school can keep an eye on. And then she asks, what can schools do to help kids not feel invisible, especially when they are depressed and don't know how much they need to be seen? And that's definitely something, we can connect her with our SEL specialists. But for you, I would ask if you have any suggestions for her as a parent, or what she could communicate to her child who might be new or feeling alone at school.
Great questions. Yeah, I'll definitely defer more to the SEL specialist for most of those questions for sure. I know a lot of schools are doing, groups and other things for kids that are feeling, pretty isolated. As far as things to recommend, can you repeat the last question again? I just want to make sure I answer it correctly.
Any suggestions for a child who is new or is feeling alone? What they can do themselves, or what a parent should suggest to them, or how to handle that as a parent?
Great. Yes. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. I'd say the best thing that we usually recommend when it comes to the kids themselves is just kind of figuring out what their interests are and what kind of qualities they're looking for in a friend. And whether it is virtual or in person, just kind of starting those conversations and putting themselves a little out there. I know it's really hard for kids that just are new and starting out schools, especially virtually, but finding people with like interests and kind of putting themselves out there, even if it feels really awkward at first, because that's really kind of the only way, especially virtually right now, to make those connections, is to find kids that, like the same things, or that you can talk to, and just kind of starting those relationships there. As for what you can do as a parent, it sounds like you're all already doing really awesome things by reaching out and caring a lot and reaching out to the school and everything like that. I think the best thing you can do is, keeping open communication, asking about how everything's going, how he's feeling, and also just kind of encouraging him to, reach out to other kids and put himself out there. That can always be helpful. Although I know it's much easier said than done, for sure. But yeah, just keeping that honest and open communication, which it already seems like you're doing, which is great.
Okay, well, that was our last question that we have. I want to put out there for anyone listening now, or who later is listening on our recording of this on our YouTube channel. If you do have other questions for Mackenzie or Teen Lifeline, or other questions on this topic that you would like some answers to, you can fill out our response form we have at the end of the program. We always ask for some feedback, so you can provide it to us or email me at programming@pvupc.org, and I will try to get you the answer, or get you in touch with someone that can get you that answer. And with that, I really want to thank you, and hope you all will join me in thanking Mackenzie Gates and Teen Lifeline and Lori Berman for putting us in touch with Teen Lifeline and Mackenzie Gates for this wonderful presentation. I know I got a tremendous amount out of it, and it's just so beneficial, so important, so relevant to us right now, always, but especially right now as things are a little bit more unusual than they have been. Also want to say thank you to Dr. Lee and the cabinet, all of our reps and our general members and guests who joined us today. We appreciate you. We are so glad that you come to us for information and support, and we are glad to be here for you. Wanted to say once again, there is a feedback form if you have questions or feedback you want to give on today's presentation. Also, be sure to fill out the parent survey on return to school so we can get that information over to the district so they can have the input of our parents. Also, the teacher and staff nominations are open now through March 10th. So be sure to turn in your nominations. We also invite you to sign up for the school vendor showcase. Don't forget, if you have at least 5 people at your school sign up, you can get cookies for your staff, which is a fun incentive. And our next meeting is Wednesday, March 10th, 2021 at 9 a.m. And our presentation is going to be on parent advocacy. I know Jessica, I think, wanted me to wrap this up. She's with us, but wasn't able to speak at this moment. So on behalf of Jessica and the entire board, we just want to say once again, thank you to all of you, and stay safe, stay well, stay positive as much as possible, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks. And we're going to